I didn't know that night could breathe so loudly until I heard the house exhale my name through the cracks between the boards. Essie, whispered the walls, as if to remind me. I was still alive, even though for months it felt like my heart had hidden somewhere between rags and coal dust. I was like a candle someone kept trying to blow out, but each time the flame only bent and then flared up again. I was born far in the South, where summer is sticky like molasses, and your fingers cling to cotton before the blood even has time to run down your knuckles. My mother sang softly, so the overseer wouldn't hear, and I learned to hold the notes in my chest, because back then I didn't even have a name. It came later, when the mistress, as fickle as a white peacock, let her gaze fall on me and muttered, "We'll call her Essie, short and convenient." That's how a slave grows roots, by someone else's whim, like a weed allowed to rise from the ground. By day, I slip out of my little room before dawn, while the rooster is still arguing with silence. The kitchen smells of damp ashes and yesterday's grease. I need cold dough to warm it with my palms, so it might rise like the very desire to live. Then my feet carry me down the corridors. Silver spoons jingle in the basket like tiny bells, and the mistress's heels strike behind me like thunderous gunfire. In the evening, I wash the floor with mint water, so ordered by the butler, so that guests walking barefoot would think the ground beneath them is fresh, free, unclaimed. Only we know it smells of our knees. Sometimes it seems that even the air holds other people's secrets. I serve roasted duck at the table, and in the reflection of the silver dish, I don't see myself, I see a girl in chains. Her eyes look right through me, as if asking not to betray her. In those moments, I ask the heavens, why do you keep my voice to yourself, Lord? Why does every no stick between my teeth like a bone? The answers rustle in the fireplace, but the embers are too quiet to understand their language. One night, the master returned later than usual. His coat smelled of rain and wine, and something heavy flickered in his gaze, like a broken horseshoe. He walked past me, and I heard a strange ringing, like an icicle dropping into an empty well. By morning, we learned the neighboring boy had been sold for daring to raise his eyes to the lady. His name vanished so fast, the wind hadn't even carried away yesterday's laughter. I stood on the porch and felt my feet sink into the ground, because fear is heavy like wet sand, and it pulls you down. But the most chilling moment came later. The mistress invited a preacher into the house, a tall man with a voice like a taut string. He spoke of salvation, of bonds that lead to heaven, and looked straight at me, as if he didn't see the dirty apron, but the fire I hid under my skin. When the service ended, he left a small Bible on the table. To this day, I don't know if it was an act of mercy or a trap. That night, I opened the book, and the pages whispered of freedom louder than any scream. Since then, I've carried the words of Scripture inside me like a coal wrapped in cloth. Breathe on it just a little, and it turns into flame. I began asking myself questions out loud, even if just in a whisper. If God sees tears, does that mean he counts them? And if so, when the cup fills, will it pour out as a storm? Every morning, as I draw water from the well, I listen to the splash. Perhaps that's where the answer is hidden. But while the answers sleep, the house lives with its secrets. The mistress now often locks herself in the room with heavy curtains, where the portrait of an ancestor in a feathered collar watches her with a judging gaze. The butler whispered that at night she talks to a shadow, as if trying to buy back her salvation with coins torn from a nightmare. Sometimes the hallway smells of incense, though the candles have long burned out. I wonder, maybe walls like people hold memories, and one day everything locked inside them will break free. For several weeks now, I've been collecting tiny fragments of light. The smile of the little servant girl who hides bread in her pocket for her sick mother. The scent of jasmine when the windows are open at midnight. the morning ray that falls on my hand like a promise. I hide them in my heart, unwind them each night, so I don't forget that there's a world beyond the chains. Maybe these crumbs are the keys, when the time comes, to open the door that, for now, only God and I know exists. It was a sweltering midnight when, for the first time, I felt as if the earth itself lifted the hem of its dress and slipped into the house. The air was thick and sticky, like cane syrup, and each drop of sweat ran down my back like a small vow to survive. That night, I was polishing silver in the dining room. The large mirror under the candlelight reflected empty space, and suddenly I saw, not myself, but a woman in an old green dress. Her face was pale, as if carved from moonlight, and she was reaching out to me. I blinked, and the reflection vanished. But a shiver rose in my chest, as though that stranger had breathed the word, "Run," onto my skin. In the morning, the mistress came down to breakfast with anxious sparks dancing in her eyes. She gripped my wrist too tightly, as if checking whether I was real, and hissed, "You've hidden something." I lowered my gaze, but inside I felt my heart beating against my ribs like a bird in a cage. Because I had hidden something. A note, a scrap of paper where the neighboring servant Timothy had scrawled in charcoal, "There's a path through the meadowsweet thicket. The moon will show the way." The way to where? Perhaps to the place where names are given back to those they were taken from. That same night, I found Timothy near the well. He held the bucket as if he were about to drop his whole past into the water. When he saw me, he whispered, "Tonight." I smelled damp wood and gunpowder, as if fate itself kept a match tucked in its sleeve. We planned to meet near the old corn barn when the tower clock struck 6 times. But slaves have no clocks. We have only the rhythm of our hearts and the whisper of the wind. So I silently counted prayers, each like a finger on a rosary. Hours still lay between us and evening, and life continued its poisonous routine. The butler checked the silverware. The mistress tightened her corset like she was trying to hold in her fears. I served sweet tea to the guests, smiling as though the sugar in it were my own private freedom. But in each clink of a spoon, I heard a countdown. The first spoon, a souled girl's scream. The second, a crack of the whip. The third, a patch of sky through the hole in our cabin's roof. I knew, if I hesitated tonight, one of those spoons would become the bell for my own chain. When the sun dropped behind the cypress trees, I noticed the same mirror by the fireplace. It was covered with cloth, but one corner had slipped. In the reflection flickered Timothy's outline, like a shadow torn from its body. He was close. I returned to the kitchen, picked up a basket of bread crusts for the pigs, and slowly slipped out the back door. The night smelled of spiced moisture and rotting leaves. Here, the darkness always spoke louder than the light. I reached the barn, where the hay creaked as if trying to warn someone. Timothy was waiting, trembling, not from the cold, but from the biting wind, in which someone's names seemed to whistle. He offered me his warm hand, not a master, not a brother, just a man who remembered what it felt like to breathe with a full chest. We stepped behind the barn and pushed into the meadowsweet thicket. I looked up. Over the marsh hung a dim moon, like an old copper penny. It slowly drifted from behind the clouds, and for a moment it felt like the sky itself whispered to us, "Now." We walked hunched as the grasses scratched our ankles and dogs barked in the distance. Each bark struck the nerves like a whip on skin. Timothy held my wrist, and I thought, if I fall, he'll pull me forward, and if he falls, I'll lift him. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a snapping twig. Behind us, a lantern flared. The overseer's voice, hoarse like torn metal, called out, "Stop." We froze, and the world shrank to the sound of my breath. The lantern swung left, its beam catching nothing. Another moment, and it disappeared again into the dark. It seemed the night itself had spared us. We reached the edge of the marsh. The water was black as spilled ink. On the other side glimmered a path leading into the grove. Timothy stepped first. The grass squelched. I followed. And suddenly the marsh seemed to come alive. My foot sank deeper than it should have. Cold mud pulled me down like a black mouth. I gasped, but the sound sank too, as if the air was too thick to carry it. Timothy lunged back, grabbed my shoulders. The mud slid over my skin like ghostly hands. With effort, we tore free, leaving a piece of my skirt behind in the bog. When we reached solid ground, I realized my belly ached, as if the place where the heart lives had clenched into a fist. We sat beneath an elm tree. I looked at my hands, shaking but free. Timothy whispered, "We're almost there." But inside me rose a strange feeling, not victory, but emptiness. I thought of my mother, her quiet songs, the little servant girl who hid bread. In my ears, the wall's whisper echoed, "Essie." And I realized freedom is not just walking out of a house. It's not leaving behind the names that could still vanish into mist. I turned to Timothy and understood my path might be different. Not backward, but not to a place where no one would know our language either. Perhaps my road was a whisper I had to pass on, so that those who remain would know the door exists. We sat in silence as the wind swayed the branches like an old cradle. Somewhere far off, an owl cried, and it seemed to call out the name of the boy who had been sold. I closed my eyes and spoke the words from the small Bible hidden beneath the canvas in my room. "And the truth shall make you free." The candle inside me flickered, but did not go out. At dawn, the tree breathed cold air, as if trying to shelter us beneath its branches, but beyond the nearest hill, the first rays of day were already flaring, and with them rose those who could see every shadow. Timothy wanted to keep moving, but I suddenly heard the inner clanging of long-removed chains ringing louder than the larks. Wherever we go, the echo will follow. I caught his gaze and whispered that I had to return. He didn't understand at first. Fear flickered in his eyes, mixed with confusion, like bitter coffee with a single, accidental grain of sugar. But he nodded. We argued in hushed tones, as if even the leaves might eavesdrop. At last, he sighed and handed me a small pouch of cornmeal. "Eat it when the road begins to taste real." Then he stepped into the thicket, and the leaves closed behind him like curtains after a final act, leaving me only his fading echo, "Be the wind." His whisper dissolved with the morning mist, and I was alone, like a note without a melody. I walked back the same way, but each step felt like an unraveled stitch on torn cloth. The yard had awakened, the rooster pecked at dawn, and the dogs were digging at the earth by the fence. I slipped through the servants' veranda, where it smelled of yesterday's split-pea soup and cold coals. In my little room, everything was in place, as though time had patiently waited for my weakness. I hid Timothy's pouch beneath a pried-up floorboard and hurried to the kitchen. The mistress was sitting by the window, and the morning ray slashed her face like a fine blade. In her hands was the same Bible, the pages cut with scissors. The words freedom, path, and truth had been sliced out like weeds, leaving gaping holes. A rush of heat rose to my throat, but I lowered my eyes and asked if she wanted breakfast. She plucked a rose from the bouquet, as if to test whether the thorns still had teeth. By noon, a carriage pulled up to the estate. A young lady in mourning black leapt from it. Her name was Miss Abigail, the niece of the late master. They said she had a heart of fine glass and dreams filled with other people's pain. As soon as she stepped inside, she asked the question that made the whole house freeze. "Where is the boy with eyes the color of walnuts? I told you not to sell him." Silence fell across the parlor, dense, as though frost had been poured under the skin. The mistress smiled coldly. He went where those go whom fate no longer awaits. I was stirring the pots when, through a cracked door, I heard their argument. The words melted like candle wax: conscience, price, reckoning. Then came the sound of a slap, and a silence that rang like crystal. The house was listening. That evening, the mistress ordered tea. She sat before the mirror, braiding her hair so tightly it was as if she were cinching a belt around secret thoughts. On the table lay a slender penknife. Without turning, she whispered, "Sometimes to pull up a weed, you must burn the field." I understood. To burn meant to erase everything that reminded her of cracks in her world. As I carried the tray away, I felt her gaze on my shoulder blades, sharp as the needle used to stitch a tear, without removing the jagged piece of cloth. That night, the house screamed. Rain pounded the windows, and a swinging lantern bobbed along the path, like a frightened heart. Miss Abigail stood without a hat, wet hair clinging to her cheeks. She demanded to see the mistress, clutching a paper, a copy of the bill of sale for a slave. The world shrank to three smells: wet earth, incense in the corridor, and fear, damp like spilled wine. I understood. If the house was already full of sparks, one word would be enough to set it ablaze. I stepped into the hallway and ran into the butler. Instead of his usual cold mask, a plea lived in his eyes. He held out a ring of keys. "You can hear how the house groans. Make the shadows leave without a scream." For the first time in many years, my heart didn't curl into a fist of fear. It spread its wings. I took the keys as if I were accepting fire. Now I whisper these words so that tomorrow I'll remember the choice. There are only a few heartbeats left until dawn. Maybe the house will explode in scandal, or maybe it will sink into silent helplessness. But if the truth is pounding to get out, I will become its voice. Even if it's my final whisper, it will echo in those who still carry chains inside. The rain had stopped, but the house was still whispering with drops, as if counting the seconds until the first scream. I stood in the hallway with a heavy ring of keys, and the metal felt warm, as if it had absorbed someone else's secrets. I stepped toward the west wing, where the windows were always veiled in velvet, and the floor creaked no louder than a prayer. The key slipped into the lock quietly, as if it had been waiting for this moment its entire life. I entered, and the darkness inside shuddered like a trapped bird. The scent of dust and spilled oil burned my nostrils. In the corner was a pile of furniture, covered in cloths, beneath which shadows seemed to shift. But at the center stood a narrow chest. Its lock bore the family crest, engraved like a brand on skin. I lifted the lid. Inside were papers, bound ribbons, and small pouches of coins. Hidden between the pages were bill of sale contracts, names of slaves, dates, prices, clean lines of ink that left behind a metallic sting on the sole. Each sheet was someone else's life, turned into numbers and signatures. I felt a wave rise in my chest. These weren't just contracts. This was a scream frozen on paper. Suddenly, a muffled thud came from beneath the floor, like someone striking a coffin lid with a fist. I recoiled, my heart pounding so hard the wooden walls echoed its rhythm. From below came a muted whisper, like a sleepy cry. Then I understood. The house didn't just store papers. It held the breath of those who had been locked away and forgotten. I dropped to my knees and found a ring in the floor hidden beneath a rug. With effort, I pried open the hatch. The smell of damp earth and clay rushed upward, and in the darkness, eyes gleamed, afraid, but alive. On the steps sat a girl of about 10. Her cheeks were smudged with soot, her hair tangled, but her eyes sparkled like two coals of hope. Behind her, in the half-light, figures stirred, women, elders, a boy with a bandaged arm. The mistress had hidden them here like an invisible debt. I reached out my hand to the girl. Shh, I'm Essie. Quiet now. We'll leave before the night fades. She placed her cold fingers into mine, and for a moment, the darkness around us grew warm. We slipped into the corridor. The house held its breath, as if listening to its own heartbeat. I led the people to the back staircase. Their steps were soft, like the breath of a prayer. Down by the kitchen, a single candle burned, its flame trembling as if unsure whether the wax was brave enough. I gave a signal to wait and entered. On the table sat a teapot, beside it the same penknife. The mistress sat with her head bowed over a glass of wine, as if listening to her pulse. Hearing the floor creak, she looked up. Her eyes were empty, like a drained well. You've chosen to betray me? A whisper, but there was steel in it. I didn't answer. I simply placed in front of her one of the contracts, the one with the boy Timothy's name, where the price was written in thicker ink than the rest. She read it and smirked. It's only paper. I reached for the candle and dipped the edge of the page into the flame. Fire raced along the words, turning them into a glowing ribbon of pain. The paper crumbled to ash on the tablecloth, leaving black traces. Now, it's dust, I said, and not a single note of fear trembled in me. The mistress rose, but I lifted the penknife. It was small, but sharp. Don't make any sudden moves, I said quietly, almost gently. In that moment, I understood. Strength isn't always in a shout. Sometimes it's in a whisper that no longer fears being heard. The mistress backed away, and in her eyes, I saw a crack, the same one from her ancestor's portrait. I stepped back, closed the door, and turned the key. The candle's flame jumped, as if rejoicing in freedom, and the mistress's shadow remained behind the wooden walls like a prison of her own making. I led the people through the back door. The rain had started again, lightly. Its drops fell on our faces like tiny blessings. We crossed the yard, avoiding the windows. Ahead lay the garden, where thick rose bushes hid the gate to the back road. I pushed it open. The hinges creaked with a sigh. The girl, still clutching my hand, whispered, "What comes next?" I looked up at the sky. It had lightened, promising dawn. "Next comes the road," I said. "And along that road, names that will return to their hearts." When the first ray of sun touched the hedges, I turned back. The estate stood still, majestic and silent, like a statue concealing rot. I knew our whisper would echo through its walls, and one day it would crack even the marble calm. But that would no longer be my battle. Mine was to keep walking while the blood was warm and the voice still alive. We moved along the path, and the morning breeze caressed our skin as if checking for lingering chains. In every drop of dew, I heard a faint chime, but it was no longer the clank of shackles. It was the melody the world plays when a soul remembers its true name. The road led us through thickets of wild lupins, their purple flowers smelling of warm honey, as if the earth itself had decided to offer a treat to the fugitives. We walked quietly, an old man leaning on a gnarled stick, a woman carrying a bundle with a baby, a thin youth with a bandaged arm, and the little girl who still held my hand, as if afraid to get lost in the dark again. A flame beat in my chest, but a weight grew beside it, because behind us remained those still caged, the mistress, the butler, the walls soaked in groans. An hour later, the first huts of the hermit settlers appeared on the horizon. Smoke rose from chimneys in warm streams, promising fire and bread. Doubt stirred in my soul. Can we trust strangers when the world is used to trading fates for silver? But I had no sword to cut through doubt. I had only a voice. I stepped to the nearest door and knocked so softly, it felt like knocking on my own future. An elderly woman opened the door. Her eyes reminded me of a stream in the shade, cool and deep. I said, "We're looking for water and quiet." She stared for a long time, as if reading words between the folds of our clothing, and then stepped aside. We entered, and inside it smelled of dried herbs and resin. She gave us blankets, laid out corn cakes on the floor. No one asked where we had come from. Sometimes the strongest question is the silence that allows you to remain human. I didn't sleep that night. I listened to the old man groaning in his sleep, the baby snuffling, the whisper of the pine forest beyond the walls. In my head, the chain rang again, now as a memory, not a threat. I thought of my mother. Her hands held me like shores hold a river. I thought of Timothy. Maybe now he walks a different road, where the stars reflect the eyes of ancestors. I whispered, "Bless us, God," and those who stayed behind. No tears ran. They simply stood in my eyes, warm and quiet like candles in the wind. Before dawn, the old man came to me. He held a carved figure, a tiny bird with folded wings. "I worked on it all night," he whispered. "Everyone knows how to get out. Not everyone remembers how to fly." I took the bird. The smooth wood was warm, and something clicked in my chest, like a lock breaking. We stayed in the hut for 3 more days. During that time, the woman taught the girl to weave baskets, the old man patched the roof, and I helped cook soup from roots and oregano. Quiet labor healed fear. But by the 4th dawn, I understood. Silence is not a home, only a bridge. We had to move on, to where names no longer sound like a sentence. When we said goodbye, the old woman gave me a small cloth pouch filled with golden calendula pollen. "Sprinkle it on a wound when your heart aches, so it doesn't heal with bitterness." In return, I gave her the chest of contracts I had taken from the hidden room. The papers crackled beneath the lid, as if exhaling in relief. "Let your hearth burn them," I said, "and let the ashes scatter in the wind." The woman smiled, as if she had seen a crack in stone bloom with a flower. We stepped onto the road and walked toward the river, where the water sang between boulders like it remembered an ancient lullaby about freedom. The old man said that beyond the river lay a land where spring cherries bloom, and people of every skin color gather on Saturdays to sing with one voice. I didn't know if it was true, but a quiet bell sounded in my heart. Sometimes faith is the first stone in a bridge. At the crossing, we were met by a carpenter. He was building a raft from 3 lashed logs. The carpenter looked each of us in the eyes, as if checking a map drawn not in ink, but in pain. The wind blew, and I saw the girl shiver. I wrapped my arm around her shoulders, whispered, "It'll be easier to breathe ahead." She turned, and in her pupils, I saw the sky reflected, clear, wide, serene. When the raft pushed off, the shore slowly drifted away, hiding the past behind its mist. I watched as the shadow house dissolved into the fog and thought, maybe one day its walls would fall, and the earth there would smell not of incense, but of cornflowers. I closed my eyes and heard the water tapping against the wood like the breath of a new world. On the other bank, willows stood, their long branches trembling in the wind like slender fingers. I stepped onto the land and felt something alive tremble beneath my bare feet. I spoke the name of my mother, the name of Timothy, the name of every soul who still hears the clink of chains in their sleep. The branches rustled, as if to say, they heard. A tear rolled down my cheek, but it was not salt from regret. It was the first rain that washes the streets after a fire. I looked at those around me. The old man was smiling. The woman rocked the baby. The youth with the bandaged arm raised his eyes to the clouds, and the girl held the wooden bird, stroking its wing with her thumb. I understood. Freedom isn't always loud, like cannon fire. Sometimes it's quiet, like a whisper that no longer fears its own sound. We walked along the path, and in every step there was a new beginning. The earth beneath our feet breathed, as if gently pushing us forward. Behind me, there were no chains clinking anymore, only the soft thump of a heart in rhythm with the future. I walked and spoke silently. If you hear my voice through years and walls, know this: I was not broken. I became the wind that carries names home.